Shoot the apple off her head and she's yours, they said. But he felt something when he saw her. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The sun had dropped just enough to throw long shadows across the main street of Dry Creek. Dust blew in low swirls, clinging to boots and coats, carried by a wind that never seemed to stop in this part of the territory. The town was no stranger to cruelty, and the people gathered outside the saloon weren't looking for justice, only distraction. Laughter carried over the sound of wagon wheels and clinking bottles. At the center of it all, a young Apache woman stood with her wrists bound behind her back. Her ankles were roped together, forcing her to balance awkwardly. The rough cord had already cut her skin raw. Her name was Ayoka, though not a single person in the crowd spoke it. She had been dragged here after being caught near one of the outlying farms, accused of stealing food. No one had asked why she was starving. No one cared. A man from the general store stepped forward with a smug grin. He held a bright red apple in his hand, polished against his vest, and placed it on the top of her head with exaggerated care, as though it were the cleverest joke he had ever told. "Let's see who's got the steadiest hand," he said. The crowd howled. Someone shouted that the winner would have himself a woman, free of charge. Another suggested they should skip the game and hang her outright. Their laughter mixed with the clink of whiskey glasses from the porch of the saloon. Ayoka stood rigid. Her dress, torn and stretched, slipped low across her chest where the seams had given way. She tried to straighten, tried to cover herself with her bound arms, but the ropes cut too tight. She kept her chin high, but inside her chest hammered. She had seen men kill for less. She told herself not to cry, not to give them the satisfaction, though her throat burned with fear. That was when Clint Morgan moved from the edge of the crowd. He had been leaning against the post of the livery stable, watching with a tightening jaw, weighing whether to interfere. He had told himself before that it was not his fight, that stepping in would draw trouble he didn't need. He lived alone, kept to himself, and the last thing he wanted was more enemies. But the longer he watched, the more the weight grew in his chest. He saw the way she trembled just once and stilled herself, the way the ropes bit into her wrists. It reminded him of other times, years back, when he had seen prisoners used for sport during the war. He still carried the scar along his jaw from that time, a knife wound he barely survived. He had told himself he wouldn't watch another person humiliated while he stood by. Clint was 36 now, a drifter who had settled into solitude on a small patch of land outside town. He had no family left, no wife, only a cabin and a few cattle to his name. The townsfolk saw him as quiet, standoffish, maybe even dangerous, though he rarely raised his voice. He carried the look of a man who had seen too much. He stepped forward into the circle, boots grinding in the dirt. The noise dimmed as heads turned. His revolver hung at his hip, worn from years of use. He didn't boast, didn't speak to the sheriff or the crowd. He just unholstered the weapon, checked the chamber once with practice calm, and leveled it at the apple. The street went silent. Ayoka held her breath, her knees weak but locked in place. She thought of running, but there was nowhere to go. She stared straight ahead, certain the bullet would split her skull. She thought of her family, lost years ago, of the tribe that had cast her out when hunger and sickness drove her to steal. Shame mixed with terror, and she bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste blood. Clint's eyes narrowed. He shut out the crowd, shut out the jeers, focused only on the apple. His finger rested light on the trigger. In his chest, he felt the old familiar calm, the same steadiness he had used as a scout when his survival depended on one clean shot. He didn't want the prize. He only wanted to end this farce without spilling her blood. The gun cracked, sharp as thunder. The apple exploded, both halves tumbling to the dirt. The echo carried down the street, then silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the crowd erupted. Cheers, curses, laughter, shouts of disbelief. The sheriff slapped his knee, grinning wide. "She's yours, Morgan. By right of the shot, she's yours." The men around him hooted and clapped. Clint lowered the revolver, slid it back into his holster. He walked straight to the woman. She flinched when his hand went to his belt, thinking he meant to grab her, but he only drew his knife. With one quick slice, he cut through the ropes at her wrists. The cord fell, leaving angry red marks across her skin. She flexed her hands once, almost in disbelief. Clint didn't look at the sheriff or the crowd. He placed a hand on her arm, steady but not rough. "Come on," he said quietly. Ayoka blinked at him, not fully understanding, but her legs carried her forward when he began to move. The crowd shouted after them, some mocking, some angry, a few laughing at the idea of Clint dragging home an Indian woman. None of them stopped him. Clint's heart thudded heavy as they passed the last building at the edge of town. He knew he had just made himself a target. Men didn't forget when you embarrassed them in front of their neighbors. Still, he didn't turn back. He only walked, the woman keeping pace beside him, her steps uneven but determined. Behind them, the noise of the town faded until it was just the sound of their boots in the dust and the steady rhythm of the wind. Clint didn't look back once they cleared the last building of Dry Creek. The noise of the crowd had already thinned, swallowed by the wind and the open land stretching beyond the town. He kept his stride even, long legs carrying him past the ruts of wagon wheels and out toward the valley road. The woman stayed close, not at his side exactly, but a few steps behind, her bare feet leaving small prints in the dust. Every few paces he heard the rasp of her breath, quick and shallow, like she was pushing herself to keep up. He slowed once, long enough to glance at her. Her hair clung damp to her cheeks, strands sticking where sweat mixed with dust. Her wrists were raw from the rope, the skin scraped red. She noticed his look and stiffened as if expecting him to speak. He didn't. He just adjusted his pace so she wouldn't fall behind. By the time the town shrank to a line of roofs against the horizon, the sun was dropping fast. Clint knew better than to push further. His cabin was still hours away, and riding out that late would be foolish. He spotted a stand of cottonwoods near the creek bed, their branches offering a break from the wind. He motioned with his chin and turned that way. She followed without a word. When they reached the trees, he dropped his saddlebag to the ground and set about clearing a space. He gathered a few dry sticks, struck a match, and soon had a small fire burning low. She stood apart, hugging her arms across her chest, eyes darting to the shadows as though she expected men to come riding after them. Clint pulled a piece of jerky from his bag, held it out. She didn't take it at first, only stared, uncertain. His arm stayed steady. Finally she reached, fingers brushing his hand quick before pulling back. She chewed slow, cautious, her jaw tight like each bite might be her last. "You'll need more than that," Clint said quietly. His voice was even, not rough but not soft either. He filled a tin cup from his canteen and passed it over. She drank deep, water spilling down her chin, and for the first time her eyes met his. They were dark, sharp, full of questions she didn't yet have words to ask in English. He looked back at the fire. He hadn't planned any of this. Truth was, when he cut her loose, he thought she'd run. He would have let her. He had no business bringing her into his life. But she hadn't run. She had followed. Now here they were, sitting in the brush like fugitives. Clint knew the men in town wouldn't forget. A few of them were drunk enough to chase, and more than a few would carry grudges against him for making fools of them in front of their neighbors. He rubbed the scar on his jaw without thinking. Trouble had a way of finding him, and he had just bought himself plenty. The woman shivered in the cooling air. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, leaving her skin bare where goose flesh rose. Clint pulled his bedroll from the saddlebag, tossed it toward her. She froze, staring at it as though it might be a trick. "Take it," he said. Slowly, she lowered herself onto it, pulling the edge around her shoulders. She didn't lie down, not yet. She watched him while he worked, her eyes never leaving him as he cleaned his revolver by the fire, and then set it aside within reach. Only when he stretched out a few feet away did she settle, curling tight under the blanket. The silence stretched. It wasn't comfortable, not yet, but it wasn't the sharp silence of the crowd either. This one carried weight, but not cruelty. Clint lay with his hat tipped low, listening to the night's sounds, the rush of the creek, the distant call of a coyote, the crackle of the fire. He knew sleep wouldn't come easy. Too many memories still woke him. The war, the knife fight that left him scarred, the faces of men he couldn't save. And now this. He wondered what kind of fool he was, dragging a woman he didn't know into his life just because he couldn't stand watching her die in the street. But when he turned his head and saw her breathing slow under the blanket, lashes resting against her cheeks, he knew why. He couldn't let it happen again, not when he had the power to stop it. Ayoka didn't sleep quickly either. Every crack in the brush made her stiffen. Every pop of the fire brought back the jeers of the men. But the ropes were gone, and no one stood laughing at her now. She shifted once, testing the edge of the blanket, and whispered something in her own tongue, so faint it was lost to the night. She didn't know if this man meant to keep her, to trade her, or to leave her at the next stop. She only knew he hadn't raised his hand against her, and he had given her water and warmth when he didn't have to. At last her eyes closed. She stayed curled tight, but sleep crept over her. Clint kept his eyes on the fire until the wood sank to embers. His hand rested near the revolver, as it always did. He told himself he'd only watch until he was sure she wasn't going to bolt in the night. But when his own eyes shut, she was still there, not running, not gone. And when dawn came, pale light spreading across the land, she was still lying close enough for him to hear her breath steady in the morning chill. The morning broke cold, thin light pushing through the bare cottonwood branches. Clint stirred first, rising stiffly from the ground. His hand brushed the revolver by instinct, then relaxed when he saw the woman still curled on the bedroll. She blinked awake at the sound of him moving, sitting up quick, eyes wary, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. "We've got ground to cover," Clint said, his voice even. He didn't know if she understood all of it, but he made a motion with his hand, rising, walking, and she nodded. He packed his few things into the saddlebag, left the fire to die in ash, and they set out along the trail. The wind had shifted cold, carrying grit across the valley floor. The woman walked silent beside him, arms wrapped tight against the chill. Her feet were raw from the day before, dirt caked to the small cuts where gravel had bitten in. He noticed her limp, but said nothing, only slowed his stride enough that she didn't fall behind. The land stretched wide and empty, dotted with sage and brittle grass, ridges rising in the distance. Clint had chosen this place years ago for that very reason. It was far from the noise of town, far from the war that had chased him for too long. He lived with the quiet, worked his cattle, and spoke to no one unless he had to. That life had suited him until yesterday, when one sharp decision put someone else in his care whether he had planned for it or not. By mid-morning the cabin came into view, a squat shape of weathered logs, roof patched with tin, smoke pipe leaning but still whole. It sat against a low ridge with the creek running not far off. A corral of split rails stood half empty. Only 2 cattle grazing nearby, ribs showing after a lean winter. A chopping block, worn from years of use, waited by the door with an axe buried in it. Clint slowed as they approached. He wasn't proud of what it looked like. The place was built for one man who expected no company. The shutters hung crooked, and the yard was cluttered with old harness and broken fence posts stacked against the wall. But it was shelter, and it was his. He opened the door and stood aside. The woman hesitated at the threshold, eyes scanning the dark interior. She looked back at him, uncertain. "Inside," Clint said. "Not an order, not rough, just steady." She stepped in. The air smelled of smoke and old leather. A small table stood at the center, rough-hewn chairs on either side. A narrow bed pushed against the back wall, blanket folded over it, and an iron stove crouched in the corner. Tools hung on nails, and shelves held tins of beans, flour sacks, a few jars of lard. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep a man alive. She turned slow, taking it all in. Her hand brushed the table, fingertips dragging through the dust that had settled from neglect. She looked back toward the door, as though testing the idea of leaving, but her shoulders sagged, and she stayed. Clint dropped his bag on the table and set to work lighting the stove. He poured beans into a pot, added water, and let warm. The woman moved closer, drawn by the smell. Her stomach growled loud enough that she looked down quick, embarrassed. Clint said nothing, only slid a tin plate across the table when it was ready. She ate fast, like she thought the food might be taken from her, until her pace slowed under his steady gaze. For the first time since he cut her loose, he asked something. "You got a name?" His words were quiet, measured. She looked up, eyes narrowing, then touched her chest lightly. "Ayoka," she said. Her accent shaped the sound rough but clear. Clint gave a small nod. "Clint." He tapped his own chest once. Names exchanged, simple, but it landed heavy in the silence. The rest of the day passed in small tasks. Clint hauled water from the creek while she swept the dust from the corners with a broom that hadn't been touched in weeks. She moved careful, uncertain of what was hers to handle, but she kept working. When she found one of his shirts folded on a shelf, she ran her hands over the fabric, then set it back neat, as though afraid to take it. He mended a fence rail outside, hammer echoing against the ridge, and when he turned, he saw her watching from the doorway, arms hugged across her chest against the breeze. There was no smile on her face, no warmth yet, but also no chains, no rope, no men laughing. That was something. By dusk, the cabin had changed in small ways. The floor was swept, the stove gave steady heat, and the air no longer smelled of dust but of food and firewood. Ayoka sat at the table, her hair falling loose, patched blanket around her shoulders. Clint sat across, spooning beans from the same pot. They didn't speak. She understood little, and he had never been one for talk. But the silence wasn't sharp the way it had been in town. It wasn't mocking. It held space, uncertain but alive. When the fire died low, Clint stood, pulled the blanket from the bed, and laid it near the stove. He gestured to it once. "Yours." He took the bed for himself, turning away without waiting for her answer. She settled on the floor, curling tight again, though this time there was warmth and the smell of food still in the air. Her eyes stayed open long after his had closed. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, if this man truly meant freedom or if some price would come later. But she knew one thing. Tonight, no one laughed while she trembled in ropes. For Clint, sleep came harder. He lay still, staring at the ceiling beams, replaying the sound of the crowd, the echo of the shot, the look in her eyes when the ropes fell. He knew the choice he had made had closed a door he could never walk back through. There would be trouble, men talking, maybe worse. But as he listened to the steady rhythm of her breathing by the stove, he accepted it. He had brought her here, and now she was under his roof. Outside, the wind rose against the shutters, carrying dust and cold across the valley. But inside the cabin, two people lay in uneasy silence, bound now not by rope, but by the weight of what had already been set in motion. The next morning broke with pale light through the cracks in the shutters. Clint rose early, as he always did, pulling on his boots and stepping out into the cold. The ground was still frozen hard, his breath hanging in the air. He moved to the chopping block, pulled the axe from the wood, and set to splitting logs. The sharp crack echoed against the ridge. When he turned back toward the cabin, he saw Ayoka standing in the doorway, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. She watched him for a long moment, silent. He kept working, driving the axe through the wood, stacking the pieces to the side. A few minutes later, she stepped into the yard. Her bare feet pressed into the frozen dirt, and she shivered once before steadying herself. She bent, picked up a log he had split, and carried it inside without being asked. He paused, axe resting against his thigh, and watched her. She didn't meet his eyes, only moved back and forth, carrying one piece at a time until the stack inside by the stove grew higher. He said nothing, but there was a pull in his chest, the faint recognition that she had chosen to help, not because he told her, but because she wanted to. After the wood was stacked, Clint hauled 2 buckets down to the creek. He glanced once over his shoulder and saw her following, the blanket dragged around her like a shawl. At the water's edge, he knelt, filling the buckets. She crouched beside him, dipping her hands into the icy stream. She hissed at the cold, then brought a handful to her mouth, drinking quick before wiping her face with her sleeve. He lifted one of the buckets and handed it toward her. She hesitated, then gripped the handle, struggling with the weight, but she carried it part way before he took it from her again. Inside the cabin, he set about mending a broken strap of harness at the table. She moved slowly around the room, studying the shelves, the tools, the iron stove, as if measuring where she fit. She found a rag and began wiping the dust from the shelves. When he glanced up, she dropped her eyes, embarrassed, but he didn't stop her. At midday, he cooked beans again, dropping a piece of dried pork into the pot. When he set the plate in front of her, she paused, then murmured, "Thank you." The words were halting, her accent heavy, but clear enough. Clint froze, spoon in hand, then gave a small nod. "You're welcome." They ate in silence, shoulders bent over the table. But the silence was different than before. It was less sharp, less heavy. Later, while he worked outside repairing a fence line, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see her standing with his hammer in her hands. She held it out awkwardly. He took it, jaw tightening, and said, "Thank you." She didn't answer, only lingered a moment before retreating back to the cabin. That evening, as the fire warmed the room, Clint sat sharpening his knife. Ayoka sat across from him, legs folded under her, mending the torn sleeve of her dress with clumsy stitches. She worked slow, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. He found himself watching her hands, small and steady despite the rough thread. When she caught his eye, she looked down fast, cheeks darkening. He cleared his throat. "You'll need better clothes." She tilted her head, not understanding. He tugged at his own sleeve, then gestured to hers, frayed and worn. "Clothes. You need better." She followed his hand, then nodded once, eyes dropping to her lap. He wondered if she thought he was mocking her, but he hadn't meant it that way. He almost explained further, then let it go. Night fell. Clint laid the bed blanket by the stove for her again, but this time she hesitated. She touched the wooden chair instead, shaking her head. "Here," she said, pointing. "She want to sit longer, not sleep yet." He lowered himself into the other chair. The firelight flickered across her face. She studied him openly for the first time, her dark eyes steady, unblinking. He met her gaze, waiting. Finally she spoke, voice quiet, words broken but deliberate. "Why me?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" Her hand lifted slightly, trembling, pointing to herself. "Why free?" Clint leaned back, staring at the fire. The truth was he had asked himself the same question since yesterday. Why had he stepped in? Why had he dragged her here instead of letting her run off into the brush? He rubbed the scar on his jaw, felt the old ache in his chest. "Because I couldn't watch it happen," he said finally. His voice was rough, low, but honest. She studied him a long moment, lips pressing together. Then she lowered her eyes, nodding once. She didn't ask again. Clint lay down in his bed not long after, listening to the soft creak of the chair as she shifted near the fire. He knew this wasn't simple. He had brought her here, but she wasn't a guest, not yet. She wasn't a prisoner either. She was something in between, something he didn't have words for. When his eyes closed, he heard the faint sound of fabric rustling. The fire stirred, and then the quiet rhythm of her breath. The cabin no longer felt as empty. It carried weight now, the kind that settled in a man's chest and told him nothing would be the same again. The weather turned colder that week, the kind of wind that carried grit against the windows and made the boards groan. Clint woke before sunrise as usual, stoked the stove, and pulled on his coat. When he turned, he saw Ayoka already awake, crouched near the fire with her blanket around her shoulders. Her hair fell in loose strands, and her eyes were steady on him. She didn't flinch anymore when he moved. "Stay warm," he muttered, stepping outside with his tools. He wasn't sure if she caught the words, but she didn't need to. He spent the morning checking fence lines. The cattle had wandered too close to the ridge the week before, and one post had cracked under pressure. As he hammered a replacement, he looked up to see her walking toward him. She carried a small bucket, her steps slow in the mud, but she came straight across the field without hesitation. She set the bucket down beside him. Inside was a piece of bread and a cup of water. Clint looked at her, then at the bucket. "Thank you," he said. She didn't answer, just stood with her arms folded across her chest against the wind. After a moment, she crouched, picked up a loose nail, and held it out. He took it, slid it into the wood, and brought the hammer down. She stayed, handing him another when he finished the first. They worked like that in silence until the fence held firm again. When they walked back toward the cabin, her shoulders seemed straighter. Inside, Ayoka had begun shaping the space in ways Clint hadn't expected. She swept the corners daily, folded the bed blanket neatly when she rose, and began sorting the few supplies he had. She stacked flour and beans into tidy rows, set tin cups together, and patched a crack in the stovepipe with an old rag soaked in grease. Clint noticed the difference when he came in from work. The cabin smelled less like dust and more like cooking, less like an empty shack and more like a place someone lived. He caught her humming once while she scrubbed a pan with sand from the creek. The sound was low, almost a whisper, but it stopped him at the door. She froze when she saw him, eyes wide, as though caught in something shameful. He only nodded once and moved to hang his coat, but inside he felt the sound linger. At night, the silences grew heavier but not uncomfortable. She tried more words in English. Wood, she said one evening, pointing at the stacked logs. He repeated it, then pointed at the stove. Fire. She nodded. Later she touched the cup. Water. Again he repeated it, and a small rhythm formed between them. The words were slow, broken, but they filled the space where before there had been only distance. Clint noticed things he had not before. The way her hands moved steady when she worked, not delicate, but sure. The way her eyes softened sometimes when she looked around the cabin, like she was allowing herself, if only for a moment, to believe this place might hold safety. And he noticed her body, the curves her torn dress didn't hide, the neckline that had stretched too far. He told himself not to, that it was wrong to stare, but his eyes drifted anyway. Each time he caught himself, he turned away with his jaw clenched. One night, rain came hard against the roof, slapping the boards, rolling across the yard in sheets. Thunder cracked, low and close. They both sat by the fire, damp from the leaks in the roof. Her dress clung to her skin, outlining the shape of her shoulders, the swell of her chest, the curve of her waist. Clint poured 2 tin cups of hot water and passed one across. Their fingers brushed again, deliberate this time, not by accident. She didn't pull away. She looked at him, her dark eyes steady, waiting. Why? She asked, her voice quiet but stronger now. He blinked. Why what? She tilted her head, searching for words. Why you alone? The question landed heavy. Clint leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire. He had not spoken of it in years. But the storm outside left no space to dodge. Lost people, he said finally. His voice was flat. War took some. Time took the rest. Easier to be alone than to bury more. She studied him, lips pressed tight. She seemed to understand, at least enough to let silence fall again. He felt her eyes on him long after, sharp and searching. It was not pity. It was something else, recognition. When the storm eased, he stood and spread his bed blanket on the floor again. But before lying down, he looked at her still sitting in the chair, the firelight across her face. You're safe here, he said. The words were rough, awkward, but honest. Her eyes softened. She drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders and gave one slow nod. That night, Clint lay awake longer than usual. He listened to the steady patter of rain dripping from the roof, the soft rhythm of her breathing by the fire. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the only living soul inside those walls. The storm passed by morning, leaving the land heavy with mud and the air sharp with cold. Clint stepped out early, boots sinking in the wet ground, checking the corral where the cattle huddled restless from the night. The sky hung gray and low, promising more rain before long. He worked in silence, mending a latch, but his thoughts weren't on the fence. They kept circling back to the night before. The way she had looked at him when he said she was safe, the quiet nod she gave, the trust in her eyes that unsettled him more than anger ever could. When he returned to the cabin, she was kneeling by the stove, hair loose down her back, coaxing a flame to catch. She had gathered kindling and stacked it neat, more careful than he ever bothered to be. When she saw him, she didn't startle anymore. She looked up and gave a small nod, then pointed to the pot on the stove. Food, she said, the word broken but steady. Clint raised his brows, set his hat on the peg by the door, and sat. She ladled beans into his tin cup, hands brushing his once more as she passed it across. He muttered, "Thank you," out of habit. She echoed the words softly, "Thank you," tasting them like she was testing their weight. They ate in silence, shoulder to shoulder, now instead of across the table. Neither said it, but the space between them was shrinking each day. After breakfast, Clint showed her how to use the axe. He set a log on the block, drove the blade through, then stepped aside. She gripped the handle, awkward at first, but tried. The axe wobbled, biting only halfway. She frowned, jaw tight, and tried again. Clint moved behind her, guiding her hands lower on the handle. "Here," he said quietly. His chest brushed her back, his arms steadying hers. She froze, then exhaled, bringing the axe down hard. The log split. She turned, eyes meeting his, breath quick. For a moment they just stood there, close, the wind cutting cold around them, while the warmth of their nearness pressed heavier than the chill. Clint stepped back first, jaw set, but his chest felt tight all the same. That evening, the rain returned. It came hard, hammering the roof, rattling the shutters. The cabin was small, fire hot, air thick. Ayoka sat near the stove, dressed damp from hauling water, fabric clinging to her skin. She pushed her hair back with her hands, strands falling across her shoulders, neckline gaping where the seams had given. Clint tried not to look, but every glance caught on her curves, the line of her collarbone, the rise of her chest as she breathed. She noticed his eyes and didn't turn away this time. Instead, she studied him, his scar, the lines at the corners of his mouth, the way his hands flexed on his knees like he was holding something back. She broke the silence. "You want me go?" The words were halting, but clear enough. Clint shook his head slow. "No." Her brow furrowed. "Why keep?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the fire. He hated words, hated dragging them out, but she deserved more than silence. "Because I don't want you out there. Not alone. Not with him." He didn't look up, afraid of what he might see in her eyes. Fear, anger, misunderstanding. But when he finally did, she wasn't looking away. Her gaze was steady, unreadable, but softer than before. She rose, blanket slipping from her shoulders, and crossed the small space between them. She stopped just in front of him, close enough that he felt the heat of her skin even through the damp dress. He stood without thinking. For a long breath, neither moved. Then she lifted her hand, slow and unsure, and set it flat against his chest. His heart hammered under her palm. Clint swallowed, fighting the urge to step back, fighting the years of silence that told him to keep walls high. But the look in her eyes cut through that, uncertain but asking, searching for his answer. He lifted his hand, set it against her waist, fingers light at first. She didn't flinch. Her breath caught, her lips parting just slightly. Clint bent his head, slow, giving her time to turn away if she chose. She didn't. Their lips touched, soft, steady, not rushed. The kiss held longer than he expected, her hand pressing firmer against his chest as if anchoring herself. When they pulled apart, the fire cracked, thunder rolled, and the cabin seemed smaller than ever. Neither spoke. Clint rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, breathing hard. She leaned into him, not pulling back. For the first time since he brought her here, the silence between them wasn't a wall, but a bridge. Later, when they lay down, he took the bed as usual, but she moved closer to the stove and stretched out within arm's reach instead of across the room. He didn't sleep much, kept listening to the rain, the sound of her shifting under the blanket, the memory of her lips against his. And when dawn broke gray and cold again, she was still there, closer than before, not running, not afraid, choosing to stay. The morning after their kiss came gray and heavy, clouds low, wind pushing hard from the north. Clint rose early, but his thoughts were far from the cattle. He moved slower, still carrying the weight of the night before, the feel of her hand on his chest, her lips pressing steady against his. He wasn't a man given to thinking much about what things meant, but this was different. She wasn't just a stranger under his roof anymore. She was inside his chest in a way he hadn't let anyone in for years. Ayoka moved about the cabin with a new steadiness. She folded the blanket neat, stoked the fire, and swept the floor without being asked. When she brushed against him passing the table, she didn't flinch. For the first time, she looked comfortable in the small space. By mid-morning, Clint saddled his horse and rode the ridge to check for strays. The air carried that tight stillness that came before trouble, though maybe it was only his nerves. He turned back sooner than planned. As he approached the cabin, he saw smoke rising from the chimney and felt that same strange warmth in his chest. But then he saw the dust trail behind 3 riders cutting across the valley floor. His jaw tightened. He rode hard back, tied off his horse, and stepped into the cabin. Ayoka looked up from the stove, her face shifting when she saw his expression. "Men coming," Clint said flat. He mimed horses with his hand, pointing toward the valley. She stiffened, eyes wide. He grabbed his rifle from a wall and checked the chamber. His revolver was already on his hip. He turned to her. "Stay inside. Don't open the door." She shook her head sharply. "No hide." Her voice was rough but firm. She picked up the small knife she had been using at the stove, holding it tight in both hands. Clint met her eyes, the fight there clear. For a moment, he wanted to argue, to push her behind the door where she'd be safe, but he saw the stubborn fire in her and knew it would do no good. He gave one short nod. The riders came fast, pulling up in front of the cabin, horses stamping in the mud. Clint stepped outside onto the porch. The men from Dry Creek, faces he recognized from the saloon, drunk and loud that day. The one in front leaned forward on his saddle, grinning wide. "You made a fool of us, Morgan," the man said. "We can't take back what's ours." "She ain't yours," Clint answered, voice low, steady. The man's grin dropped. "You think you could just walk out with her? You think we let that stand?" He pulled his revolver, letting it dangle loose in his hand. The others followed suit. Clint raised his rifle slow, leveled it steady. "Turn back." The leader spat. "You ain't got the guts to fire." Before Clint could answer, the door creaked behind him. Ayoka stepped out, knife in hand, blanket falling from her shoulders. Her hair whipped in the wind, eyes dark and sharp. The men laughed when they saw her. "Look at that," one jeered. "She thinks she's a fighter." Clint felt the weight of her presence at his back, fear curling cold in his gut. He kept the rifle aimed, voice hard. "Last warning." The lead man smirked, lifted his pistol higher. "She's coming with us." The crack of Clint's rifle split the air. The shot tore through the man's shoulder, sending him crashing from the saddle. His horse reared, screaming. The other 2 cursed, one firing wild. Clint dropped low, chambered another round, and fired again. The second man's hat flew, his horse spinning. The third turned his animal hard, spurring it away. Within moments, the valley rang with the sound of retreating hooves. Clint stood in the doorway, chest heaving, rifle still hot in his hands. The man he had shot groaned in the mud, clutching his shoulder. He looked once at Clint, rage burning in his eyes, then staggered onto his horse and followed the others. The silence after was heavy. Clint lowered the rifle slow, breath steadying. He turned to Ayoka. She still gripped the knife, knuckles white, but her chin was high, her body trembling only slightly. She met his eyes. "You see," she said, voice shaking but strong. "No hide." Clint stared at her a long moment, then nodded. "No hide." They went back inside, the cabin close with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Clint set the rifle on the table, rubbed a hand down his face. Trouble would come again. That much was certain. Men like that didn't forget. But as Ayoka set the knife down, her hand brushing his for just a second, he knew something else too. Whatever came, she wasn't going to leave, and he wasn't going to let her go. That night, as the fire burned low, they sat side by side. She leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, and for once Clint let the tension drain from his body. The danger wasn't gone, but the choice had already been made. They would face it together. The air inside the cabin was still thick with the smell of gunpowder and damp earth. Clint sat at the table with his rifle laid across it, the barrel cooling, his jaw clenched tight. He could still hear the retreating hoofbeats echoing in his head, still see the flash of hatred in the wounded man's eyes before he staggered onto his horse and rode away. Trouble wasn't finished, not by a long stretch. Ayoka sat across from him, knife still on the table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup that shook faintly though she tried to hide it. Her eyes were fixed on him, steady but searching. She wasn't broken, not even close, but her body trembled with the weight of what had just happened. Clint watched her, waiting for the fear, the blame, the question of why he had brought this danger to her doorstep. But none came. Instead, she spoke low. "You fight for me." Her English was halting, but the meaning was clear. Clint exhaled slowly. "I fight for what's mine to protect." He stopped, the words heavier than he meant. His scar itched his chest tight. He looked at her again. "Not because you're property, because you're here, under this roof, with me." Her eyes softened, the faintest hint of relief flickering across her face. She set the cup down, stood, and crossed the short space to him. She stopped at his side, her hand brushing against his shoulder. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That night, neither of them moved far from each other. When Clint lay down, Ayoka chose the bedroll not across the cabin, but at the foot of his bed. She curled under the blanket, close enough that he could hear her breathing slow, steady. For a long time, he stared at the ceiling, fighting the thought that nothing in his life had ever felt this certain, that he wasn't alone anymore, and that leaving her behind was no longer something he could do. The next morning broke cold, but clear. Clint rose and set about chopping wood, his body sore but steady. When he turned, he saw her at the creek washing clothes. Her dress, one of his old flannels he had left folded, and the ragged blanket she had carried since the night he cut her loose. She scrubbed with her hands red from the icy water, lips pressed tight with determination. When she came back up the hill, arms heavy with the wet cloth, he met her halfway, taking the load from her. Their fingers brushed, lingering longer than before. She let out a quiet laugh, quick, surprised, the first sound like that he had heard from her. It struck him harder than he expected, and for a moment the weight of everything else fell away. Later, as they shared bread at the table, she asked haltingly, "Will you stay?" "Here." She pointed to the cabin, her eyes lifting to his. Clint studied her face. He thought of the town, of the men who would surely return, of the quiet life he had managed to carve for himself before all this. He thought of the nights alone, the meals eaten in silence, the way the cabin had felt more like a tomb than a home. Then he looked at her, alive, steady, sitting across from him with fire in her eyes, even after facing death. "We stay," he said, voice rough but certain. Her lips parted in a small breath, and she nodded once, slow, as if sealing something unspoken between them. That evening the air grew colder again. Clint stoked the fire, the cabin warm against the wind outside. Ayoka sat close, hair damp from washing, wearing his old shirt over her torn dress. The firelight caught the curve of her face, the fullness of her figure beneath the fabric. She watched him with quiet intensity, not looking away when his eyes lingered. Clint moved closer, slow, deliberate. He reached for her hand where it rested on her knee. She tensed, then relaxed, letting his rough fingers curl around hers. Her hand was smaller, calloused, but soft against his. She leaned into him, shoulder brushing his arm. "You sure?" he asked, his voice low, the words rough from disuse. She met his eyes. "Yes." Clint cupped her face, thumb brushing her cheek. Their lips met again, firmer this time, not tentative but certain. She leaned into him, her hands gripping the front of his shirt. The kiss deepened, breaths mingling, the fire snapping loud in the silence. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his chest, her breath fast, her body trembling not with fear but something else. Clint held her there, one arm tight around her waist, the other hand resting light on her back. For the first time since the day he cut her loose, he felt the weight of loneliness lift from his shoulders. She wasn't a stranger anymore. She wasn't someone passing through. She was choosing to be here, and he was choosing her in return. Outside, the wind howled across the valley, but inside the cabin, the fire burned steady, and two people who had started as nothing more than survivor and rescuer now stood together as something stronger. Partners bound not by chance but by choice. The days after the fight passed without sign of riders. Clint kept his rifle near at all times, checking the ridge at dawn and dusk, but no dust trails rose from the valley. The town had learned its lesson or decided he wasn't worth the blood. Either way, the silence held, and each day, without trouble, felt more like a gift than a reprieve. Ayoka settled into the cabin as though she had always belonged. She mended his shirts with careful stitches, patched holes in the blanket, and stacked wood against the wall higher than it had ever been in his years alone. She spoke more English each day, piecing words together, pointing, repeating. Clint corrected her when she asked, his gruff voice patient in ways that surprised even him. One morning, he came in from the corral to find bread baking in the stove. The smell filled the cabin, warm and rich, something he hadn't tasted since before the war. She looked up when he entered, flour dusting her hands, and gave a small smile, just a curve of the lips, but struck deep. For the first time in years, the cabin smelled like home, not just survival. That night, by the fire, she asked the question that had hung unspoken between them. "You want me to stay always?" Clint froze, staring at her across the flicker of flames. He thought of all the years he had lived with nothing but silence, all the nights staring at the ceiling waiting for sleep that never came. He thought of the day in Dry Creek when he cut her free, how he told himself he would let her run once they were clear, and how she hadn't. She had followed, step for step, and each day since she had filled the cabin with something he thought he'd buried for good. "Yes," he said finally, voice low but steady. "I want you here, with me, for good." Her eyes softened, relief and something warmer flickering through them. She leaned across the space, touched his hand. "Then, I stay." Clint closed his rough fingers around hers, a weight lifting from his chest he hadn't known he carried. The days grew longer, spring pushing through the valley. Together they planted a small patch of earth behind the cabin, turning soil with an old hoe, dropping seeds, watering from the creek. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. When the sun fell, they sat shoulder to shoulder on the porch, watching the lights sink behind the ridge. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer sharp, no longer filled with suspicion. It was the kind of silence that carried peace. Sometimes she hummed under her breath as she mended, and Clint found himself listening, comfort in the sound. Sometimes he told her about the land, where the creek swelled after rain, where the cattle liked to graze, where he had nearly broken his leg the first winter, cutting ice. She listened, head tilted, learning his world the way he was learning hers. One evening, after the chores were done, she came to him not with questions, but with certainty. She stood before him, her dark hair braided, wearing the shirt he had given her. Her eyes met his steady, no fear there now, only resolve. "You my home," she said, the words broken but clear. Clint rose, breath catching. He set his hands at her waist, pulled her close. "And you're mine," he answered. The words were heavy, but they were truth, and for the first time in years, he let himself say them without fear of losing what he claimed. They kissed again, deeper this time, the kind of kiss that sealed things no crowd, no town, no work could break. She leaned into him fully, her arms tight around his shoulders, and he held her as though letting go was no longer an option. When they broke apart, the fire burned low, but the cabin felt warmer than ever. Clint touched his forehead to hers, eyes closed. "We'll make it here, together." Ayoka nodded, her hand resting over his heart. "Together," she echoed. And so was the cabin, once silent and empty, now carried the sound of two lives joined. The scrape of chairs, the thud of wood on the chopping block, the low murmur of voices learning each other's words. The valley, once a place of exile, now held the weight of something permanent. Clint no longer lived alone. Ayoka no longer lived in chains. They had chosen each other, and that choice would stand.